Today, my group, which consists of Grace, Jenna, myself, Olivia, and Robert, will be presenting the case of Brandenburg versus Ohio, which occurred in 1969. To begin, we'll discuss the facts, which is what happened. So in 1919, Ohio had enacted the criminal syndicalism statute, which made it illegal to advocate for political violence. Following that, in the summer of 1964, Clarence Brandenburg, who was a known Ku Klux Klan member, gave a speech to a gathering of KKK members in the Hamilton County of Ohio. He also had invited members of the press to attend and record the meeting. During this meeting, he made anti-Semitic and anti-Black statements, as well as suggested that the government was suppressing the Caucasian race. Brandenburg then called for revengeance and said that the members of the Klan should plan to march on Washington, D.C. on Independence Day. For this, Brandenburg was convicted under the Ohio Syndicalism statute for advocating for violence in a political manner. His attorney who picked it up, Alan Brown, took the case to the Supreme Court to question the constitutionality of the conviction of Brandenburg. Next, we will discuss the issue, or what rights were violated. So first, we are going to look to see whether the Ohio criminal syndicalism statute violated any rights at all. We also are going to be looking at whether criminalizing the advocacy of political violence is a violation of the First Amendment rights, which states that Congress shall make no law respecting freedom of speech. Next, we would look at whether it violates the 14th Amendment, which no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States. And finally, we will look at whether or not this conviction is consistent with the clear and present danger test, which was introduced in earlier years during the Schneck versus United States trial.
So what are the rules of the case? And more specifically, how is constitutionality defined in the United States? So the Ohio criminal syndicalism statute states that crime, sabotage, violence, or unlawful methods of terrorism as a means of accomplishing industrial or political reform is illegal and punishable in the state of Ohio. So again, this is the law in Ohio that Brandenburg was convicted under. His conviction raised a question of constitutionality under the First and 14th Amendments of the United States. So the First Amendment reads, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or of the right to the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. The 14th Amendment grants equal protection of the laws to all citizens of the United States. So again, Brandenburg's conviction under the Ohio syndicalism statute raised the question of constitutionality of that law under those two amendments. And then the final rule that is relevant to this case would be the clear and present danger test. This test was introduced in 1919 in Schenck versus the United States. This test states that speech may be restricted if it creates a clear and present danger of substantial evils that the government has a right to prevent. We deemed this test relevant to the Brandenburg case because it is precedent set by the United States Supreme Court that puts a constitutional restriction on the freedom of speech.
For my portion of our presentation, I'll be focusing on precedent cases and if they are consistent with the ruling of Brandenburg v. Ohio. The first related case we looked at was the 1919 case, Schenck v. the United States, This case's significance lies in the invention of the clear and present danger test to determine whether or not a state could constitutionally limit an individual's freedom of speech. The case ruled that if an individual's speech presented a clear and present danger to society, then the speech could constitutionally be limited. This case is consistent with the ruling of Brandenburg v. Ohio because the Supreme Court failed to recognize whether or not Brandenburg's speech presented a clear and present danger. Ultimately, Brandenburg's speech, while advocating for political violence, did not incite violence itself. Another case we looked at that we believe to be relevant to the Brandenburg case was the 1927 case of Whitney v. California. In this case, Charlotte Whitney, a founding member of California's Communist Labor Party, helped organize a group looking to cause economic and political change with the unlawful use of violence. Whitney claimed her intentions did not include the organization acting in the way it did, and that her prosecution violated the First Amendment. The court upheld her conviction and claimed the First Amendment was not an absolute right, and that, quote, words with a bad tendency could be punished. Years later, in 1969, the Whitney decision was overturned with Brandenburg v. Ohio. We also found the 1927 Fisk v. Kansas case to be similar in nature to our case. Fisk was tried for violating the Kansas Criminal Syndicalism Act after being found with Union literature that advocated for revolution against economic systems of the United States. Similarly to Brandenburg, Fisk was found not guilty as he did not present an actual or imminent intent to actually overthrow U.S. government or actively attempt to change economic structure. Another case we thought had relevance to Brandenburg was the 1951 case of Dennis v. the United States. 11 Communist Party leaders were convicted of advocating for a violent overthrow of the U.S. government. In short, the Communist leaders argued that they did not have specific plans to overthrow the government, but that their party's philosophy generally advocated for an overthrow of governments. After almost 8 hours of deliberation, the jury found all 11 defendants guilty. However, in 1969, with the Brandenburg case, it was a de facto overruling of Dennis v. the United States, holding that mere advocacy of violence was protected speech without incitement to action. And finally, the last case we examined was Noto v. the United States of 1961. Noto was convicted in 1956 under the Membership Clause of the Smith Act, which declared it a felony to be a member of an organization that advocates for violent overthrow of the U.S. government. His conviction was upheld by the Court of Appeals due to the idea that it was not just a matter of membership, but, quote, of membership with knowledge and criminal intent. However, in 1961, with the Noto v. United States, Noto's conviction was overturned unanimously on the basis that there was not sufficient evidence that the organization had advocated for actions against the government. We conclude that all of these cases we examined are relevant to the Brandenburg v. Ohio case on the basis that they include aspects of the clear and present danger test determining if an individual's freedom of speech should be limited.
Analysis. How did the court use these rules? The Supreme Court ruled that Brandenburg's conviction due to the Ohio criminal syndicalism statute was unconstitutional under the First Amendment. Brandenburg v. Ohio set new precedent within the U.S. criminal justice system by establishing something called the Brandenburg test. This test can be inferred as an updated version of the clear and present danger test, and it guides the judicial system in determining if speech can be restricted in a constitutional manner. The Supreme Court of the United States opinion stated that the Ohio law failed to recognize whether Brandenburg's advocacy for violence caused imminent lawless action. Imminent lawless action is a requirement for speech to be criminalized. This requirement is consistent with a precedent set by Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes in Schenck v. United States in 1919. The Brandenburg test states that speech can be criminalized when it is directed to inciting or producing imminent lawless action and likely to incite or produce such action. So basically, if somebody makes a threat that they are actually going to act on, that is the only way that speech can be criminalized. Justice Hugo L. Black filed a brief concurrence in Brandenburg. He stated his opinion that the clear and present danger doctrine should have no place in the interpretation of the First Amendment. Justice William O. Douglas also wrote a separate concurrence that agreed with Justice Hugo L. Black. Conclusion. What was decided? The results of the ruling. The Hamilton County, Ohio conviction of Brandenburg was ruled as unconstitutional, and it was a violation of the First Amendment rights of freedom of speech and press. Brandenburg's conviction under the Ohio Criminal Syndicalism Statute was ultimately overturned. The Brandenburg test for freedom of speech was established. The Supreme Court ruled that speech advocating illegal conduct or political violence was protected by the First Amendment unless it was likely to incite imminent criminal activity. The precedent set by Brandenburg v. Ohio can be seen in Hess v. Indiana. After being arrested for protesting Indiana University, Hess's speech was constitutionally protected under the Brandenburg test, as it only advocated for illegal activity. It did not initiate it. To this day, Brandenburg remains good law and has since been used many times to protect free speech.